Okay, here we go, the last online lecture of the year. Okay, so today's lecture, at least part of it, is on barriers to voting, and we know that the South was super racist and they tried many different ways to keep African Americans from voting. Below is a list of some things. They held primary elections that only white people could vote in. That was declared unconstitutional in 1944. They tried to pass poll taxes that made African Americans have to pay, actually made everybody have to pay a tax to vote unless your grandfather had voted, in which case you did not have to pay the tax, which was basically a way of saying if you're black you can't vote without paying because your grandfather didn't vote because you were probably a slave. And then poll taxing was banned by the 24th Amendment, and the grandfather clause was eventually declared unconstitutional. And then finally there was literacy tests where they would ask like super biased questions. They'd ask a white guy to read, a sentence that said the cat jumped over the tree or something, and then an African American would have to read a paragraph from the Bible and interpret what was going on. Basically, it was a test designed to make an African American fail. Okay, I forgot to tell you on that last slide that literacy tests were overturned by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I've seen test questions that have like African American vote and it's like flat, and then in 1965 it jumped up. And you need to know it jumped up because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here's what the Voting Rights Act did. It said that you could no longer do literacy tests. It said that the federal government would go down to the South, or really any place that had racism, and they would actually register voters. What's funny is the Supreme Court recently stopped this action, basically saying racism was over in the country. Kind of controversial. It empowered federal officials to ensure that citizens could vote. Like they would even have like federal marshals down there, like police officers, to make sure that they could vote. And it empowered federal government to count the ballots. Basically, it's saying we can't trust the South to run their own elections. Okay. So what was the effect of the Voting Rights Act? It increased black turnout like big time, and it led to a big increase of black candidates that were actually elected to office, and it forced white officials to take account of the needs of blacks. So suddenly someone running for Congress who's white has to consider what African Americans want. In the 1990s, they started to be a little more aware of creating districts that had a lot of minorities in it so that candidates to Congress would become more diverse, because they would naturally probably vote for somebody who was a little more diverse. In 1993, they said you cannot gerrymander based on race. And 1995, they said race cannot be a huge factor when you're drawing lines. Okay, the next section of the notes is private discrimination and the federal response. In other words, discrimination that occurs not in government, but in like businesses and stuff. So we know that the 5th and the 14th Amendment prohibit the government from discriminating, but what protects you from a business discriminating? Well, it's a little more difficult. The 13th Amendment says you can't have slavery. Congress is able to use the Commerce Clause to regulate commerce. And the power to tax and spend and attaching strings to that can affect these things. So let's look a little more closely. So in 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited racial discrimination in making private contracts. So it started kind of small right after the Civil War. Much more significant was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in public places like movie theaters and restaurants and that kind of thing. And they did this based on Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. This is one of those tricky things where it's like, I'm obviously in favor of this, and like people should not be discriminated against in a restaurant or something, but it's kind of questionable if Congress had the power to do it, according to the Commerce Clause, were they overstepping their boundaries? I'm glad the law exists, but if you follow the Constitution, there's some question about that. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act says it prohibits employment discrimination based on sexes, gender, and Employers cannot be required to give racial preference to remedy past discrimination, but they may voluntarily. In other words, you can't play favorites hiring African Americans, but you are allowed. I'm sorry, you don't have to play favorites, but you are allowed to do so. In 1968, we had another Civil Rights Act, and this one looks like it had to do more with housing, to make sure that if you were applying for an apartment and you were black and so was a white guy, they were not allowed to play favorites. Like, for instance, I rented out my house. I wasn't allowed to ask the race of the people that were renting my house. Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 bans age discrimination for jobs unless age is related to job performance. Americans with Disabilities Act bans job and access to facilities discrimination as long as a reasonable accommodation can be made. All right, and our last note is on citizenship. I think it's our last note. I don't have time right now to show you a citizenship test, but if you want to have some fun, you can Google online and see if you can pass a citizenship test. So, how do you become a citizen? You can become a citizen by birth, like being born in this country, you're automatically a citizen. This is a Latin way of saying by birth is jus soli, which means the right of soil, which means you're born on the land and you become a citizen. And another way of putting this is jus sanguinis, which means, like, let's say both my parents are from America, but we're staying in Italy for a year. I'm still a U.S. citizen because I'm the son and daughter of two American citizens. Maybe I might even have dual citizenship, Italian citizenship and American citizenship. Okay, another way of becoming a citizen is through naturalization. What that means is that you came here as an alien and you applied for citizenship and you passed a test and you took an oath and you pledged allegiance to the United States and you became a citizen. This can be done on an individual basis, which is, when you as a person met various requirements. It can be done on a collective basis when Congress decides to give a bunch of people citizenship, like we did with Hawaiians and Puerto Ricans. So how do you lose citizenship? You can voluntarily renounce your citizenship. Perhaps becoming, you want to go live in Nicaragua and become a citizen of Nicaragua, you could renounce your American citizenship. There's denaturalization, which is the stripping of citizenship from a naturalized citizen who gained it through fraud. They lied or something. All right, there are different types of aliens in this country, and I don't mean the guys that come in UFOs. An alien is a citizen of another nation who's living in the United States. There are resident aliens, which means they're kind of allowed to be here, permanent residents. There are non-residents that are here just for a little while. There are illegal aliens. I think that's a word we have heard a lot in California, people who enter the country without permission. There are enemy aliens, citizens of a nation that we are at war with. And there are refugees who fled political persecution. In this case, it's like in their country they were in danger, and so we allowed them to come here under refugee status. So what rights do these people have? They're basically the same rights as U.S. citizens, except they can't vote. They can't serve on a jury. They can't hold every single job they want to hold. They can't stay in the United States forever. So how many aliens do we allow in the U.S. each year? Under current law, about 675,000 can come in the United States each year. How we let them in is based on a pretty complex system. We look at, do they have family in the United States? Do they have a job skill that we want to have here? And back in the day, it seemed like we were only taking Europeans, which is pretty racist. So we made some changes in, I think it was 1965, where we wanted it to be more diverse. So it's, yeah. And then political refugees can come here if they're in danger in their country. And that's up to around 100,000 people a year. And that goes above our 675 number. So a little known fact, when Ronald Reagan was president, we passed the Simpson-Mazzoli Bill of 1986. And what that did was it provided amnesty to illegal aliens who were here before 1982, What that means is if you were an illegal alien and you came to America in 1981 and you were hanging out and Ronald Reagan passed a bill that said you could basically become legal. Not a lot of people realize this because Republicans really like Ronald Reagan, but that's not a very Republican policy to sign. And it seems like really far-fetched that we could do something like that today with a Republican as president. After this, you would get fines for employers who hired illegal aliens, like knowing that they're doing it, and a certain number of aliens are allowed to enter each year as temporary farm workers. So if we analyze this law, you could say that you're basically giving legal sanction to people who broke the law. They made employers kind of nervous to hire any Hispanic for fear that they might get fined, and it raised concern that these temporary workers coming in might be exploited. In the modern day and age, immigration has been like a real tough topic for presidents to address. Of course, Obama was more forgiving of immigrants, but unable to pass any kind of law that would make it okay for them to be here or give amnesty, even though I would probably guess he'd be all right with that. Trump, of course, was elected on the promise of building a wall and shutting down immigration. And in fact, a lot less people have crossed the border since he became president, despite the fact there is no wall. Where have our immigrants come from in the past? Well, way back in the day, they were mostly coming from white Europe, Northern and Western Europe. That's like France and England. 1880 to 1920, they were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is like Italy and Ukraine and, kind of like Slavic people. And we started to change our immigration policy in the 20s. We were pretty racist, playing favorites with like England and France and Ireland and stuff, and not really taking a lot of people from Asia or Southern and Eastern Europe. And then I told you earlier, in 1965, we start to get much more diverse, and we start to create quotas, I believe, where it's like, we must take this many people from Nigeria, we must take this many people from the Congo and stuff, trying to bring a little bit more diversity and equality to our immigration system. Okay, ignore this slide. The lecture is done. We're done. Hooray.